Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. Once again, I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it is my sincere pleasure to be joined by James Still, who's a playwright and has a new play coming out, The Widow Lincoln, which will run from January 23rd to February 22nd. And the venue, I think, is really a special place, and that being Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. So, James, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I do want to hear a little bit about what inspired you to pursue such a play, but I think first and
Sure.
foremost, why don't you share with our audience just a little bit about what, this play is?
Sure. Well, Ford's Theater, like many cultural organizations in Washington, D.C., are part of the 150th anniversary of the assassination of President Lincoln in April of 1865. And to commemorate that event, they commissioned me to write a new play. We talked about a variety of things. The most obvious thing, of course, would be to write a play about the assassination. And it's interesting when you're asked to work at a place like Ford's Theater, and I've had two other plays there. The assassination itself is inescapable at Ford's. Being an audience member there, no matter what the play is that you're watching, I think it's impossible not to be aware of the history that hangs over that place. And as someone a lover of history, I find that thrilling and a little daunting. And so the idea of writing a play that dealt so specifically with the assassination is my response initially was I sort of felt like the theater itself told that story. I didn't know really what story I had to tell to add to that, because just the experience of being there was the story of the assassination. But I had written another play that premiered at Ford's in 2009 called The Heavens Are Hung in Black, which was about Abraham Lincoln, set in 1862 during his year of wrestling with the Emancipation Proclamation. And during that time and my research into that play, I had become intrigued in a lingering way with Mary Lincoln. And so I proposed to Ford's in response to their invitation that maybe there was a play about Mary Lincoln that would in fact fulfill this idea of looking at the assassination and looking at it from through a different lens, if you will. So I had done some digging around in history, and someone like yourself is probably very familiar with this, but I think a lot of people are not familiar with sort of what is almost like a historical footnote, which is that after Lincoln was shot in Ford's and then carried across the street to the Peterson House, died early the next morning, on April 15th, 1865, Mary Lincoln was taken back to the White House. And she refused to go into any of the rooms in the White House where she had any memories, which meant her own bedroom, the bedroom where Willie had died. And she ended up in a room that she had furnished to be Lincoln's sort of summer, a room for him to write in the summer months that were to be coming up. And she didn't leave that room for nearly 40 days and 40 nights. And of course, we know very little about what happened in that room. She left very little behind by way of journal or letters or diaries about the actual events in that room. So you can imagine, as a playwright, someone looking for a place of juicy, dramatic, heightened moments in a person's life. All pistons in me sort of went wild, and I thought, I wonder what this might be. And so that's what I proposed to Ford's, and happily for me, they said yes. And I went about the business then of what that play might be, and immersed myself then in those documents.
Right. Now, I wondered if you could elaborate just a bit more on the documents, on the actual research involved in this
Sure.
process, because you do your homework, and I think that's very
Yeah.
important for our viewers to know that you try to be as authentic as possible here. So what
Yeah.
were you looking at, and how could you
Yeah.
glean from those sources to try and fill out your
Sure.
narrative?
Well, first, let me say, I am not a historian. I'm not, and I don't mean that as an apology. I just mean it as fact, and I have great respect for people who've, dedicated their lives to that. I am a writer. I am an artist. I live in a more imaginative world, I suppose, than in a factual world. But when I'm dealing with a play that does traffic in any kind of history, I really like to know my stuff, and especially in a play that's going to premiere at Ford's in Washington D.C. I know there are going to be people who come to see this who know it all, and so I want to assure the audience members who do bring that into the theater with them that they're seeing a work of art that starts with a real working knowledge. So the research is really important to me. So of course. I did a lot of reading about the assassination itself. I tend to, when I'm writing something that's taking place in this instance in 1865, rather than looking at some of the more contemporary research that's done, in a way, I'm sort of doing the same thing that those writers did to write those books. And so I'm going back to the sources of the 19th century and trying to read accounts of people who were there or who say they were there, reading, the attending doctor at Lincoln's bedside, reading his notes about as Lincoln was dying. Those were very moving to me and become a part of the play in a very surprising way. I visited Lexington, Kentucky, and spent time at the Todd home there. I, of course, went to Springfield and spent time with historians and in the museum, at the Presidential Museum. I have friends at the Library of Congress who I call on and to really help me maybe uncover some sources that I wouldn't have come at otherwise. So it's a lot of reading. It's an immersion into whatever I can find. Carl Sandburg wrote a wonderful, it's a very small book, but he was part of the new wave who was starting to look at Mary Lincoln in a more empathetic light. So I was looking at things that were both very critical of Mary Lincoln. I also it was very interesting, I looked at plays that were written in the 19th century about the Civil War and about the assassination, which these plays were wild. I mean, I couldn't write anything that was nearly as wild as these plays. But that was actually very liberating to realize that dramatists who had come before me had really looked at this stuff and had really come up with some really exciting and kind of crazy ways of storytelling. That led me, of course, to characters like Laura Keene, and I did a lot of research on her theater, on her as a producer, on the plays that she did. Of course, Mary Lincoln's letters, all through her life, just looking at the way she used language, the way she talked about sorrow and grief and envy and all of the many parts to her. I also spent time with Louise Taper, who's one of the largest private collectors of Mary Lincoln and Lincoln artifacts. She lives in Los Angeles, which is where I live as well. And, it's, I don't know if this is true for historians or more people who are more academic in terms of their research, but for me as a dramatist, to get to hold a Bible that was Mary Lincoln's, something happens, I think, to a writer, to an artist who is in the presence of those kinds of things. And so I rely on all those kinds of connections to sort of fortify my own confidence about then sitting down and trying to do, what is almost an impossible thing, which is to write a play about Mary Lincoln.
So I wondered, James, if you could perhaps give us a bit of a sense of your Mary Lincoln. I think for a lot of the general public, it's not just, I think, Civil War audiences in the kind of the wake of the movie Lincoln. Obviously, Sally Field portrayed Mary Lincoln, and I think that a lot of people saw that movie, and I think that gave one portrayal of Mary Todd Lincoln. So I wonder if you could try and describe a little bit of what your Mary Todd looks like.
Well, I love what you're saying, David. It's about my Mary Lincoln, because let's face it, it is my version. There is no definitive version. I am not the first, nor I will be the last person to try to capture the spirit of Mary Lincoln. I've tried to look at her through the lens of the events that happened to her. And of course, we know those facts from being a mother who eventually lost 3 of her sons, to the wife who was holding her husband's hand when he was shot in the head, to a woman who came to Washington, D.C. expecting great things and being greeted by, really by a city that was really a swamp, and a White House that was very run down, hardly the grand house that she expected it to be. So I've really, she is a very mercurial. She's smart and savvy and ambitious. She's difficult. She's someone who has had a lot of tragedy happen to her. And I think that for me, it's been, how does someone deal with those events? That it reveals so much about how they respond to tragic events. So for me, again, what's been interesting, I think, when I wrote The Heavens Are Hung in Black, and of course that was much more focused on Lincoln as a character, I was very aware of, there was a kind of intellectual battle about Lincoln. There's so much information about Lincoln, and you could spend the rest of your life reading books and papers about Lincoln. Mary Lincoln is different. There's not as much there to read about, but it's much more of an emotional kind of argument about Mary Lincoln. And so I've been very aware of how much more emotional it has been to work on her story, mostly because there's a sense, there's still a real battle about who was Mary Lincoln. And, by writing this play, I've kind of inserted myself into that conversation, I guess. So, again, I'm looking at it through the lens of somebody in the 21st century, but I'm looking at it as a story about a woman in Victorian America, where she had many fewer options than women who followed her. She was the first lady whose husband was assassinated while in office. And that was a big clue to me about no one knew how to do that. No one knew what that meant. No one knew how should she be taken care of. And she wasn't. There was a big battle, of course. Eventually, she was given a stipend, an annual stipend, but she had to fight very hard for that. Things that we take for granted now. But again, just going back to your question, most directly, what I would say is that I've tried to write to a Mary that is complicated and smart and political, very protective of her husband, someone who took motherhood very seriously, and someone who, may not have been the easiest person to be around, but was always fascinating.
Now you have Mary Bacon portraying Mary Todd Lincoln in this play. And I wondered if you could just speak a little bit to Mary's abilities, and obviously this is someone who comes from a long history with Broadway productions, as well as being on screen and TV. Yeah. So I wondered if you could speak to, how you see this partnership of the character Mary Todd Lincoln and Mary Bacon working together.
Yeah, I love the language you use, David. I mean, I think the idea of the partnership between the actress and the character she's playing is very astute. And I will say, I've known Mary for a long time, Mary Bacon. She did a world premiere of another play of mine. I think it's about 8 years ago now, and we became friends. And I've seen her in many things. She's a very respected actor in New York and around the country. It's been fun because over the last many months, once Mary Bacon was cast, telling people that Mary Bacon was going to play her, inevitably the response has been great excitement, and there's such respect for Mary's work. And look, it's a really big role. It's a complicated character who never leaves the stage. She is all over the place emotionally. It's a lot of language. So it requires an actor with an incredible skill set, and both emotionally and just the craft of how do you do a performance like this 7 or 8 times a week, again and again and again? How do you rehearse it for 8 or 9 hours a day? How do you live with that kind of character who's going through what Mary Lincoln is going through? So I couldn't be more excited than having Mary Bacon play it. And I'm so fortunate because I know her work. So I'm just on fire just thinking about what she's going to make of the role. And, this is that wonderful time where a character, a role, there's a kind of a passing off that happens between writer and actor. I've been working on this for several years, and we go into rehearsal tomorrow. And that idea that I'm about to watch an actor take this on and in a way take it off of me a little bit. It's a huge unburdening, and it's a huge sort of sharing that happens between writer and actor. And I'm so excited about what she's going to do with the role.
And finally, James, just one last question for you. I wondered if you could perhaps speak a little bit to the fact that this is taking place at Ford's Theater. And you've obviously alluded to this, and this is not your first production at Ford's Theater, but obviously this one is detailing an event that occurred fundamentally at the theater, and now you're dealing with the aftermath of a grieving widow. So how does the fact that this play is taking place in such a powerful location impact the way you write, and impact, and obviously I know once you get into rehearsals, I'm sure that there's going to be a whole lot of tweaking involved, but how did you kind of conceive of writing this play and understanding the power of the venue?
Well, part of it is knowing that power. Part of it is just really being honest about that and not trying to get around it in any way. You've been to Ford, so you know that basically every seat in the house, you can see the box where Lincoln and Mary Lincoln were sitting in. And so it's a little, even as well as I know it, I can't quite imagine what it's going to be like that first time when I'm sitting in the theater watching the play about that event. I will say that, as you know, Laura Keene's company was performing Our American Cousin on stage, and in my play, we see fractured moments from that as well. So not only is it the assassination, but it's also the play that was being done. We're seeing pieces of that being performed in a very fractured way because it's happening through the lens of Mary's sort of nightmare of what that night was. She keeps returning to that and trying to escape it. So there's incredible power about that. But it's funny though about history though, because on the one hand, Ford's Theater is this iconic, deeply emotional, physical place where something terrible happened 150 years ago. And history is also about things that happen to real people. And so a lot of my play is so much about the fact that this really happened to somebody. It's not a history lesson in that it's not a retelling of history. It's an emotional experience of history, I guess, is how I would describe it. And I think that it being in Ford's Theater only enhances the kind of the way that my play lives and moves through its own time and in its own rules. Look, it's funny to be talking to you on this night because I get up tomorrow and I'll go into a rehearsal with a bunch of people, many of them whom I know, some of whom I don't. And this thing that I've been really working so hard on and dreaming about and sort of toiling over and torturing myself about in some ways, it begins, in a new way tomorrow. And then once we move into the theater itself, then it begins again, So there are so many layers to this, and maybe it's a good thing, because I think if tomorrow I walked into Ford's Theater and we started rehearsing the play in Ford's Theater, I think it would just be overwhelming for me. I mean, I think it would just be too much to take on in a way. I need to ease into this because it's such a charged experience. Now, I can't predict that for an audience. I can't control an audience experience. I hope that an audience has a deep personal experience, and that whatever they thought about Mary Lincoln, I don't even know if I can change their minds, but it might make them think again about who Mary Lincoln might have been, and how we might have responded under similar circumstances. And I think that's one of the things that theater can do. It can invite people to imagine what it would be like to be somebody else. And in this case, that somebody else is the one and only Mary Lincoln. And wow, what a person to spend time with.
Absolutely, James. Well, I want to thank you again for taking some time to speak with us. Again, the play is The Widow Lincoln, running from January 23rd to February 22nd of 2015, which will be here before we know it, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're very well aware of that.
Oh, yeah.
But tickets are for sale, obviously. You can get them off the Fords Theater website, fords.org. You can also call them. But certainly sounds like a play that no one who is a true lover of the Civil War should miss, especially as we move ever so closely towards the 150th of the assassination. So, James, break a leg. And hopefully we can chat again at some other point if you dabble in Civil War dramas again.
I would love it. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.